Over the years, we've presented Sacred Trust. We've had the pleasure of hosting renowned Civil War historians, authors, National Park Service rangers, and licensed battlefield guides so that they can share their unique perspectives on the Battle of Gettysburg with you, our visitors. Coming up, Jeffry Wert will present An Army Reborn, Lee and His Army from the 7 Days to Gettysburg. Jeffry Wert is the author of 9 books on Civil War topics, most recently From Winchester to Cedar Creek, the Shenandoah Campaign of 1864, published in 2010, many of which have been published in multiple languages and countries. A former history teacher at Penns Valley High School and resident of Center Hall, Pennsylvania, his articles and essays on the Civil War have appeared in many publications, including Civil War Times Illustrated, American History Illustrated, and Blue and Gray Magazine. Please welcome Mr. Jeffry Wert.
Well, good morning. I guess it's good to be in Gettysburg. It's crazy. I'm surprised. I'm not surprised. I'm surprised how rapidly we were able to get in here and be able to park. So, but anyhow, if you have questions, please ask them. I always like to take time for questions. I enjoy questions. If you don't agree with what I have to say, I also enjoy hearing that. We can argue over that or whatever. That's why we're here. Because if Gettysburg or any other Civil War battle wasn't controversial, many of us wouldn't be here. So please, if you have them, ask them. When Robert E. Lee rode out 9 Mile Road from Richmond on Sunday, June 1st, 1862, to assume command of, or temporary command, in fact, of what would soon be christened the Army of Northern Virginia, I must tell you there were concerns both in the Richmond and within the Army about this appointment. At that time, Lee's cloud still hung over Lee's reputation. If you remember, he was the commander in Western Virginia in the fall of 1861, and the campaign failed. Well, it was a combination of lack of arms, lack of discipline among the troops. Also, he had subordinates who would rather fight with themselves than fight with the Yankees. And Richmond newspapers said he was timid. He was afraid to fight Yankees. They called him Granny Lee. And so after that failure, he was, if you will, exiled to the South Atlantic coast, where he was in charge of building fortifications. But in March of 1862, Davis brought him back to Richmond as his military advisor. So when Joseph Johnston was seriously wounded on May the 31st, Davis turned to Lee. Now, by seniority, Lee deserved the appointment. But frankly, there was nobody else he could turn to. You're not going to give it to Gustavus Smith, who held the command briefly for a day because he had almost a nervous breakdown in command of the Army. So Lee took command of the Army. One of the concerns, and it's well expressed, and you're probably familiar with it, within the Army, what kind of man was he? Is he going to take chances? And one of those men who was concerned with that was Porter Alexander. He was the ordnance officer, and he encountered Major Joseph Ives of Davis's staff. And to Alexander, the Confederacy had to take chances. They had to take risks. And he wanted to know if Lee was that man. Did Lee have audacity? And this is the reply that Ives gave to Alexander, and I quote, "Alexander, if there is one man in either army, Federal and Confederate, who is head and shoulders far above every other one in either army in audacity, that man is General Lee, and you will very soon have lived to see it. Lee is audacity personified. His name is audacity. And you need not to be afraid of not seeing all of it that you will want to see." Lee was combative. His personality is combative. I know we have this image of Lee, there was a book entitled The Marble Man and all that, but Lee had a combative personality. However, and this is more importantly, Lee's audacity, or his willingness to take risks, is not necessarily based in a combative personality. It was in his reasoned assessment of how the South had to win the war. If you remember, In the winter of 1862, the South more or less adopted a passive defensive strategy. What was the result? Defeats at Fort Henry and Donelson, the capture of Nashville, the capture of New Orleans, defeat at the Battle of Shiloh, and more importantly and more threatening, the massive 100,000-man Army of the Potomac under George B. McClellan was only a handful of miles from outside of Richmond when Lee assumed command. And Lee looked at the picture and he understood something. This war is a war between two democratic societies. In other words, it is the civilian will to sustain the war effort that's critical. And Lee understood that his ultimate opponent was the Northern populace. If the Northern populace will no longer sustain the war effort amid bloodshed and sacrifices, the South has a chance to achieve its goal of independence. The South could only win the Civil War by a political settlement. They're not going to conquer the North. The North, in turn, has to conquer the South. But for the South to do that, all they need to do is to bring the Lincoln administration to the negotiating table and work out a settlement that grants Southern independence. And Lee understood that. Well, how do you get that? To Lee, you have to take chances. You just can't sit back and wait. Because what did waiting mean? You have a foe who is vastly superior in natural resources, manpower, and everything. And at some point, if you will, Lincoln will probably find a general who will unsheath that sword of Northern might, and the Confederacy's doomed. A long war the South cannot sustain against such an enemy. So to Lee, they had to take chances. They had to gamble in the sense of taking the war to the enemy. And if you would inflict a series of battlefield defeats upon the enemy, upon the Federals, you may be able to break the will of the Northern people. So this is the lead that came out 9 Mile Road that Sunday. Now, if you think about it, the planets must have aligned somewhere at that moment. Because who was waiting for him? James Longstreet, A.P. Hill, D.H. Hill, Lafayette McLaws, Jeb Stuart. At a lower rank, John Bell Hood, William Dorsey Pender, Robert Rhodes. And in the Shenandoah Valley, who's soon going to come to him, is Stonewall Jackson and Richard Ewell. If you take those men, there is nothing in the Army of Potomac that compares to these men at this time. The Army of Potomac, in some sense, was still saddled with some of those old fossils that they dragged out of the War Department in 1861, and they're still in Corps Command. So Lee inherits this kind of leadership at the time he's there. What about the Army? Well, he doesn't know it yet, in a sense. But what he is going to get is something you probably can't quantify. But as D.H. Hill will say, it's that incomparable infantry. They're there waiting. And at some point, maybe, they're going to have a general who will unleash them. So when Lee takes command, in fact, folks, in 2 days after he takes command, Lee looks at the situation and decides he is going to assume the offensive against McClellan's army. He cannot sit back and wait. If they do, McClellan's going to bring the siege guns in, and he's going to plummet the Confederate defenses around Richmond. The result, as you all well know, is the 7 Days Campaign. One thing I want to mention about that up front. First of all, it's a campaign by Lee predicated on maneuver. He is going to turn the flank of what happens to be the 5th Corps north of the Chickahominy River and drive McClellan's army away from Richmond, hopefully by maneuver. Of course, as we well know, he is going to attack at Gaines Mill, he's going to attack at Glendale, and of course he's going to attack at Malvern Hill. So we have this image of Lee. And you're all going to walk out here in these fields, and we'll get to that, but there's this image of Lee who is going to be willing to sacrifice the blood of his men. At Gaines Mill, he had to attack. He had to attack in the sense of he only left 25,000 men south of the Chickahominy River. The bulk of the Federal Army was south of the river. If McClellan figured it out, McClellan could push in to Richmond while Lee's north of the river. So to keep McClellan's attention focused north of the Chickahominy, Lee takes the attack at Gaines's Mill. What about Glendale? It was a missed opportunity, as the Confederates had come to know. But again, the Federal Army was retreating on the road. If he severed that retreat route, he could scatter the Army of Potomac all over the peninsula. So they went at it at Glendale. Now what about Malvern Hill? It's usually linked always with Pickett's charge when we assess Lee. Lee was on the left flank of the Army mid to late afternoon on July the 1st. He is with James Longstreet. He has decided that he is going to not attack the Federals of Malvern Hill. Then he receives two pieces of false information. One was that the Federals were retreating again. Well, he'd been chasing them nearly a week. Are they going to retreat again? Do we have a chance to overtake that retreat? And secondly, again wrong, that they had made some ground up. They had been moving forward towards Malvern Hill. So Lee orders the attack. And of course, as D.H. Hill said, it was not war, it was murder. Those brigades, I think 16 of them went up that slope and they never had a chance. But again, it's a tragic, tragic miscommunications. However, the end result of the 7 days, as we look at turning points, folks, this is a major turning point in the Civil War, the 7 Days Campaign. It's a strategic victory for Lee. But what does it mean? It means that Lee now, and he will hold this for 2 years roughly, he is going to hold the operational or strategic initiative in the Eastern Theater. He turns the war upside down. Remember, the Northern War Department had closed recruiting offices in the North because they were so sure McClellan was going to take Richmond and the war is going to end soon. Not so. So in other words, for 2 years, for the next 2 years, essentially, now there are occasions, and by occasions maybe a few days or a week, Lee is going to dictate where and when the war is going to be fought, in a sense. Now, he really believed, and he was very disappointed. He thought, and he uses these words again, crush or destroy. If you read Lee's reports, that's what he wanted to do to the Federals. He wanted to destroy them. And he thought he should have in the 7 Days Campaign. Well, he didn't have a staff to do it. We know that maps were woefully inadequate. The terrain did not favor the coordination. And so the Army, in Porter Alexander's estimation, was a clanging machine. It just wasn't well oiled, it didn't work. One of the problems, too, and it rears its head early, is there's massive straggling in the Confederate ranks. Thousands of men are not going to go into battle during the 7 Days Campaign because they're stretched out on the roads. Lee will turn his attention north then, of course, against John Pope and the Union Army of Virginia. All I can tell you, and I don't know where, and I don't know necessarily why, but it's somewhere in those roads of central Virginia, this army stopped clanging. They started to come together under Stonewall Jackson's wing and James Longstreet's wing. And as Longstreet would write later, Second Manassas was Lee's masterpiece. Again, folks, it's a campaign based upon maneuver. Broad, turning, flanking moving, executed brilliantly by Stonewall Jackson. By the way, I should interject here. Lee was disappointed in Jackson's performance in the 7 days. Now, most historians tend to accept the fact that he basically, physically, he was so exhausted and tired that mentally it affected him and he lost his fire. Because if anybody had a fire in the belly, it was Stonewall Jackson, wanting to take it. Remember, he told the VMI cadets when they left in 1861, if you're going to war, you unsheath the sword and you wield the sword. So Jackson, to Lee, it was a concern. But he lets Jackson do this operation, as we know, Cedar Mountain and then a turning movement. What does he do? And this is Longstreet's view of it. They maneuver the Federals into such a situation that they have to attack the Confederates, and they are badly bloody. And to be honest about it, Longstreet's counterattack on August the 30th came very close. It was that crossroads there of Sudley Road and Warrenton Turnpike down below Henry House. If they would have captured that, the Army of Virginia would have been scattered all over. But they don't reach it. Straggling remained a problem. And so as Lee turns north to go into Maryland, this is an army that's on the limits of physical ability to carry out and wage a campaign. It's a bold maneuver. There's no question about that. Very interestingly, Lee asked permission of Davis if he could invade Maryland. He asked that permission after he'd already started the army into Maryland. So he was going to take him there. But this is an army, and this is where the straggling becomes epidemic. These men have simply reached limits physically, and they're not going to be able to hold up. By one book, and one of the best books on the Antietam Campaign is Joseph Harsh's Taking That to Flood. And Joe, he's a late Joe, unfortunately, he saw, and quite correctly, that roughly when Lee was at Leesburg, he had about 75,000 men in the Army or nearby being able to go into Maryland. As we well know, probably only 40 of them stood in the ranks at Sharpsburg on September the 17th. Lee would say later that the Battle of Sharpsburg was the greatest day in the history of the Army. And folks, it was. If you think about it, you think about the slaughter, the number of men in the morning's action in the West Woods, East Woods, and cornfields, scattered on, what did they have, 8,000 killed or wounded just in a 1 square mile area. The center of your line collapses along Sunken Road. The only defense you have is James Longstreet and staff officers manning cannons and a Major General Harvey Hill gathering up whatever infantry he can find and leading a counterattack. And then your right wing collapses. But they hold on, of course, because A.P. Hill arrives. As one North Carolinian soldier wrote or exclaimed in the middle of fighting, he said, "My God, won't the sun ever set?" But this was the greatest day in the history of the Army. What they gave Lee was survival, and he understood that. Interesting about that, late in the afternoon of September the 17th, Jackson's over there. He's hanging on. The Federals are not renewing the attacks in his area. Lee sends him an order asking if he could see whether or not the Federal right flank was vulnerable to an attack. As Lee's army's collapsing on the right side, he's asking Jackson whether he can take the offensive. So Jackson sends Jeb Stuart out on a reconnaissance. Now, folks, I got to admit to you, I don't understand why, but Jeb Stuart dearly loved to fire cannon at Yankees. So he rolls a couple pieces of cannon out there to see whether there's any Yankees in the neighborhood and fires them. The problem is there were 40 of them on a ridge. And he soon found out that, yes, the flank was well anchored, so he comes back. There was no hope to outflank McClellan's army there. But yet this Lee, thinking of a killing blow, even contemplated it. What about Fredericksburg? Well, Fredericksburg was, in the words of one of the men in the Army, the easiest battle we ever fought. And indeed it was. But I always like to reverse it in a sense. Their opponent, the Army of Potomac, is always going to play second fiddle, if you will, to the Army of Northern Virginia. Douglas Southall Freeman's father was a veteran of the Army of Northern Virginia. And he asked him about the Army of Potomac. And Freeman's father replied, "The Army of Potomac was the best army in the Civil War, except for one which modesty forbids me to mention." However, what we look at, and if you want to know the Army of Potomac and the ones that are come to these fields, all you need to do is think of December the 13th, 1862, and that mile-long slope before the stone wall. Because 35,000 men in a blizzard of artillery fire and musketry. Folks, at some point, the gunfire was so intense on that slope that the dead were moving. So many bullets were striking them that they had the appearance that they were still alive and they were dead. And yet they went up that slope. This is the Army of Potomac. This is the men and the courage that they had. And all they ever asked for was a fair fight on a fair field. And it certainly wasn't that case at Fredericksburg. Chancellorsville is regarded as Lee's greatest victory. Bold gamble. He will take that chance. He will divide his army, and he will launch that famous flank attack and rout the 11th Corps and turn the battle on its head, and he'll achieve a great victory. And he will resume the offensive on May the 3rd because he had to unite the wings of the army. My point is, if you think about this so far, 2nd Manassas, Antietam, and Fredericksburg, the Army of the Northern Virginia fought a defensive battle. They did not assume the offensive except at 2nd Manassas to counterattack. Of course, what you could not replace after Chancellorsville was Stonewall Jackson. His loss was irreparable. They will never find a replacement for him. Lee understood that, and of course he will reorganize the army. I will tell you that there were problems within the high command in the sense that, who does Lee turn to? He turns to 2 Virginians. Now he says that A.P. Hill is the best officer at that grade, in other words, division command. Richard Ewell came back. Richard Ewell is quite a fighter under Jackson. I mean, he thought Jackson was crazy early on. Well, most people who served under Jackson early on thought he was crazy. But he came to have great respect for Jackson and what he could do. And so these are the 2 men selected. Now, when you think about it then, the high command of the Army of Northern Virginia, the only non-Virginian was James Longstreet. And only 40% of the Army was Virginian. And one of that percentage was based upon the fact that the cavalry was almost all Virginian. But if you look at the infantry units, and you look at particularly in the 1st Corps, you're not seeing many, except for Pickett's division. Almost all the rest of them are lower South states. So in other words, though, there is some of this undercurrent of dissent over this, but more than likely they were the 2 best choices, certainly, and Lee made them. And then he turns, as we know, north. If you read Lee's report, I guess the modern word in a sense is spin. Lee says, I'm going to take the boys into Pennsylvania, and we're going to spend some time there. We're going to enjoy the fruits of this wonderful Cumberland Valley. And if we happen to run into any Federals, we will fight them if necessary. Now, I am being a little snide in that, but that's when you break it down. Not quite, in my judgment. And again, that's open to dispute and argument. But in my judgment, Lee came north to settle this war. Look what he had achieved, except for the strategic setback at Antietam, and that's a critical strategic setback because of what Lincoln does after that. But Lee came north now to settle this. Lee is very attuned to the political situation in the North. If you read his letters to Davis in June of '63, that's what they talk about, the political situation. Davis, in fact, names a 3-man commission that will be prepared to negotiate with the Lincoln administration upon a Confederate victory in Pennsylvania. So when Lee takes his army here into Pennsylvania, this is to settle affairs. In a sense, I would say, Gettysburg ends up a reckoning. It's a reckoning for both armies. For Lee, it's that prospect of victory and Confederate independence. For the Army of Potomac, who's going to trail the Confederates here, it's not only a reckoning, it's an opportunity for redemption. If you read their accounts, diaries and letters, as they are going through Virginia in forced marches and then in Maryland, but when they crossed that border, they fully understood what was at stake. There's no question about that. Remember, Pennsylvania is a free state. And to people back then, there's another element. Pennsylvania is the birthplace of the Declaration of Independence in the United States Constitution. And that mattered to people back then. This is that Pennsylvania, the keystone. And then so as they go north, there's this, and especially among Pennsylvanians, there's no question, they wanted to settle this too. They wanted another chance at the Army of Northern Virginia. Alpheus Williams, the division commander in the 12th Corps, wrote on June the 29th, 150 years ago today, he wrote home and he said, if we lose this battle, we lose this war, and we lose the cause. So when they come here, they understood that. And all you have to do is look at this on these fields here. What Lee didn't understand, well, he couldn't know. And he didn't, there's no way he would have known that he had not defeated the Army of Potomac at Chancellorsville. You understand that? He didn't defeat the rank and file. He defeated its commander, Joe Hooker. So when the Army of Potomac comes onto these fields, as I told you before, it's an army looking for a fair fight on a fair field. I will just jump ahead in sense. After the campaign is over, on July the 15th, as Lee's army is in Virginia, the surgeon of 154th New York will end a letter to his wife with these words. This army, meaning the Army of Potomac, this army is an anomaly. It is an army of lions commanded by jackasses. Gettysburg, there were less jackasses, and that made a difference in this field. But what about it with Lee? You know, we look at this. James Longstreet did not want to fight here on July 2nd. By the way, Lee did not want to fight here on July 1st. There's no question about it. Oftentimes, you know, it's been argued, some and others argue differently. Well, it was Harry Heath that drug Lee into this battle here at Gettysburg. No, it really wasn't. It was probably Richard Ewell. Because Richard Ewell comes down Harrisburg and Carlisle Pike with his two divisions. Lee arrives here 1:30. And Ewell's stepson will come over and tell him that they're in position to make an attack. And Lee reluctantly agrees to that assault. That assault, sweeping away the 1st and 11th Corps, will tie Lee to Gettysburg. It is that afternoon attack, because Harry Heath, after getting bloodied in the morning, he does pull back. And of course, then they win a major victory here. They wrecked 2 Union Corps. They killed John Reynolds, which they found out that they had from prisoners. And of course, Lee had the opportunity to hold the initiative here, to take the battle. And so when Longstreet will argue, no, General Lee, we should march south, find a good defensive position, and let the Army of Potomac attack me, Lee said no. If the Army, and he's pointing to Cemetery Hill, he said, if the enemy is there tomorrow, I'm going to attack him. And that was, Lee's decision was sound. The problem was, I'm not going to go into refighting Gettysburg in that degree, but the problem for Lee initially on July the 2nd was, where was the Union Army? Where was the rest of the infantry? That's another problem July the 1st. Stuart's not up. How's he going to screen a movement? Where are we going to find the rest of the Army of Potomac? So Lee has to spend most of the morning coming to a decision on an attack plan, and they will finally arrive at that. Now, by the way, I know Longstreet's been called Peter the Slow, other words. I read a few years ago in a magazine article, Longstreet was not necessarily bright. And the reason for that was he graduated 54th in the class of 56 at West Point. Folks, I want to tell you something. I taught high school students for 33 years. IQ and where you graduate in the class are not necessarily related, particularly among males. Okay? So I think Longstreet was pretty smart. He didn't talk much, I mean, you know, but he was pretty smart. Anyhow, he does not finally start the attack for reasons. One, Evander Law's brigade is coming from New Guilford. Those poor boys are going to march 24 miles to get here, and then you get an assignment to attack those little hills down there. And so Longstreet starts about 12:30. What I want to tell you briefly, and they're going to be ready to go in about 4, and they have to counter march. If any of you have not been there, go to Black Horse Tavern Road. Go by the tavern, make a left, and then a quick right, and you go up there, and there's this rise. That's where the counter march, that's where the march stopped, and they had to counter march. So if you haven't been out there, it's worth seeing. Anyhow, in the 1920s, the United States Army decided to duplicate the march. You know they didn't beat it in time? I don't know how many there were. The United States Marine Corps comes here, 800-man battalion. Well, you know the Marines are going to beat it, and they do by about 30 minutes. 800 men. Longstreet marched 14,500 on that march and counter march. And then they lined up. And as Longstreet would say later, they did the best 3 hours of fighting the troops could ever do. Again, in my personal judgment, if you take that line and you start with the Alabamians and you go with the Texans and you got Georgians in support and you go up through to the South Carolinians and you go to the Mississippians, these are First Corps men. These are the best shock troops in the Army in Northern Virginia. If you asked me to conduct an attack at that stage in the war, I would have given it to those boys. And look how close they came. As one of them exclaimed in the middle of the attack, "My God, do we have the universe to fight?" As one Yankee brigade after another Yankee brigade just pounds it and stops it, and they have to keep fighting. And we all know how close they came. And Longstreet was right in that justification. If you want to fault Longstreet for anything, it happens on the night of July the 2nd. Now, we're not certain about this, but what Lee does, and we know from accounts we definitely know he did not talk to James Longstreet and to Richard Ewell. Whether he talked to A.P. Hill, I can't tell you that. I have a hard time finding A.P. Hill in this battlefield, so I can't be sure that he talked to him. He may have, I doubt it. But Lee issues orders that the general plan remains unchanged. The general plan for July the 3rd was for Ewell to renew the assault, and you know they fought in Culp's Hill night of July the 2nd. You will renew that assault. He is being reinforced by 2 brigades from Rhodes. He gets extra Billy Smith brigade comes up, Stonewall brigade comes up, so he is reinforced. On the right flank, Evander Law, who replaced the wounded Hood, and Lafayette McLaws' division supported and reinforced is the better word, by George Pickett's division, will renew the assault against Lower Cemetery Ridge over the same ground again. See, Lee thought that the platform, in other words, that ridge of the peach orchard, was good artillery support for an attack. But George Pickett never was given the order to be in the battlefield at dawn on July the 3rd. Primarily, the responsibility must rest with James Longstreet. Now, Pickett came up in the afternoon of July the 2nd. He reported to Lee that his division was at hand, and Lee said, "General, rest your men. I will call for you when I need you." He went to speak to Longstreet. He told Longstreet what Lee said. Now, after the war, Longstreet tried to, in other situations, get out of that, and he said, well, he was still under Lee's direct command because he was in charge of the wagon train. Well, that really doesn't wash. But what happens is, when Lee gets up on the morning of July the 3rd and rides south on Seminary Ridge to meet Longstreet, there is no George Pickett division on the field. So Lee, one half of Lee's primary plans for the July the 3rd is wrecked. So he has to come up with something. Well, could you delay the assault in Culp's Hill? No, because the Federal artillery will open fire about 4:45, and they're going to draw Ewell's men into that fight. In fact, the Federals were planning to attack down Culp's Hill. The Confederates attacked first up Culp's Hill. I will tell you, they never had a chance. Many of you probably know this, but one of the unsung heroes of Gettysburg is George S. Greene, because he made his men build breastworks on the morning of July the 2nd on Culp's Hill. And those breastworks saved that flank of the Army. There was roughly 9,000 men in each side in Culp's Hill that morning. The Confederates would launch 3 attacks, and none of them came close. John Geary, one of the division commanders, so assuming roughly he commanded 1/4 of the troops involved in the fighting, in his report he said that his division alone that morning expended 277,000 rounds of ammunition. That means that roughly 1 million rounds of ammunition was fired at Culp's Hill that morning in that fight. But then what about Lee? Well, we know what Lee does. He designs, plans what we call Pickett's charge. Why? Well, you have to believe that Lee thought they could do it. Otherwise, it makes no sense. Would he sacrifice those men to cross that ground? I don't think so. The problem with it is, it's predicated upon some problems. First, you're going to pit your weakest arm, the artillery, against the Federal Army's best arm. I've said many a times, on this battlefield in Malvern Hills, another case, if you want to create hell in the battlefield, give it to Henry Jackson Hunt. And Hunt will do it. And he did. And Hunt readied his artillery for what he believed was going to be an attack, when some people said, no, they're just lining up those Confederate cannon because Lee's going to retreat. He said, no, they're not. And the purpose of the bombardment was to sound Union cannon, so your men could get across that ground without being torn to pieces. And of course they weren't. Once the Union artillery opened fire, I guess the best thing I could tell you is a quote from a soldier in the 14th Virginia, who's in Armstead's brigade. He wrote home soon afterwards, hands, arms, and legs flew in the air like feathers before the wind. And that's what happened to him as he crossed the ground. And of course the attack, in my opinion, never had a chance of success, ultimate success. What is overlooked is George Meade that morning issued orders to roughly 13,000 troops, and like 2nd Corps, Caldwell's divisions, others, you will be prepared to move to any section of the line that's in danger of being broken. So in other words, had they broken through, they probably would have been seeing a vanguard of Federal reinforcements coming at them. When the Federal soldiers, Gibbon's division and Hayes's division on Cemetery Ridge saw them coming, and they shouted Fredericksburg, Fredericksburg before, as they're coming at them. They'll shout it afterwards, but even shout before. One man in Hayes's division stood up and said, come on, come to death. As I told you, they wanted this fair fight. But when we look at Lee, we always think about it. I mean, I will tell you, when I took students down there, and I always brought my students here to Gettysburg, and they always walked out to the guns in front of the Virginia Monument, and inevitably one of them would say Lee was stupid. You know, it's a favorite word of teenagers for anybody over, 30 or whatever, I don't know. And no, he wasn't. But what was there? After the war, Lee did interviews. He didn't do many, he did a couple with men. One of them was William Allen, which was an ordnance officer. And I would assume the words are Lee's, but Allen puts them as though they're his. And on that afternoon of July the 3rd, 1863, on Cemetery Ridge was, as Allen said, and I assume what Lee told him, was this great prize. The prize was Confederate independence. Lee almost had to make this attack. He had come so far. He had asked everything of his army that he could have possibly asked. Look at the battlefield. They believed on July the 1st from evidence they were invincible. Lee may have had a touch of that thought too. But he could not have paid them greater compliment than what he asked them to do on July the 3rd. And then when we frame these things about Lee, and you've seen where, Lee preferred the bloody road. Lee would take these chances, and he was willing to drain precious Southern blood. In these 13 months I'm talking about, Lee inflicted roughly 97,000 casualties and suffered 90,000. Now, percentage-wise, that's much worse for his army, because they're numerically inferior. Well, they said, well, look at Grant. And I've seen articles, well, Grant's not the butcher, Lee is. The problem with that, folks, is they're comparing apples and oranges. Of the 12 bloodiest battles in the Civil War, 9 of them are fought in the East. In the East, they're shooting each other. In the West, they're maneuvering across vast territories. If you want to assess Lee and Grant and compare that, you compare it when they engaged each other in '64. But what is the choice? What is the choice that Lee faced? It isn't what, some historians said, no, they should have waged a broad guerrilla war like Washington did. Well, they didn't have railroads in the 1770s. they could penetrate. The Federals could. Well, they should have a passive defensive. Well, that didn't work too well. And casualties in the defensive oftentimes are not that much lower than an offensive or siege or something. If you look at history, and that's what we have to look at, not what it could have been or would have been, Robert E. Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia changed the course of the Civil War. They almost came to achieving Confederate independence. It was still an uncertainty in the summer of 1864 until Atlanta fell. So I would argue, figuratively and literally, that the Army of Northern Virginia was reborn on a June Sabbath in 1862. Thank you.
I wonder if I could ask you to engage in a little speculation. I am myself from Princeton, New Jersey, and I'm thinking about the American Revolution and the 10-day campaign, and particularly the Second Battle of Trenton, where Washington flanked the British and then marched to Princeton and had his victory there. Could it have been possible for Lee after the second day to have concentrated the army and then feinted north, and then flanked the army around the north and actually crossed the river and onward to Philadelphia? What river? Susquehanna? Oh. The question is this during the Gettysburg campaign? Or right? Yeah. Well, I know Scott Mingus was before me, and Scott knows about everything you need to know about York County and everything in the war. I know he wanted, as far as we know, again, when I say I know, I always couch that. But he wanted to capture Harrisburg for political and symbolic reasons. That's why he sent Ewell there. But going across the Susquehanna would have really stretched things. But I believe he was planning to. It might have been a dangerous enterprise. Please keep in mind, when Meade was given command, Meade was ordered to do two things. First and foremost, you will protect Washington and Baltimore. And then secondly, you'll go find Lee's army and defeat it. And so it would have been an interesting thing in speculation, but it would have extended Lee's lines considerably. And one of the there's no question that they wanted to garner all the foodstuffs, everything they could from these farms around here. There's no doubt, and they do. It's how many animals are tens of thousands of animals, the food stuff, everything else. That was critical. He fed his army for months off of Pennsylvania and these farmers down here. So, again, speculating, I think it would have been a very difficult enterprise or any extended campaign there. But, I can't say that for certain.
Hello, there it is. Thanks for another great lecture. I've been to other talks with you. I wanted to ask you one of the inevitable questions about Gettysburg is related to the pursuit, after the battle has concluded, and whether it is that Meade made a poor decision in not pursuing and then holding a council of war, on July 12th, and basically feeling like he had to have a vote with his commanders about what we should do, reconnaissance and force, or a real advance, to try to basically catch Lee before he recrosses the Potomac. But do you feel that is a real failing in Meade as a commander of the Army of the Potomac, that he failed to pursue adequately, or he could have caught Lee before he crossed the Potomac again?
Question, of course, you all heard it right on Meade. I'm of the school that I'm not that harsh on Meade. First of all, you have to look at what Meade does initially with his infantry. Now, his cavalry's out there right away, and that's what you do. You send your cavalry out after him to slow him down, to hamper him, to whatever. But remember, he had to protect Washington and Baltimore. So where does he go? He goes to Frederick. He has to protect that. That's where he sends the bulk of his infantry. To me, that's why he does it, Again, too, and I think reason for that, this is still the Army of Northern Virginia. It might have been lamed, but it's very dangerous. Was Lee going to go down and then turn? Another factor, of course, is the weather. Now, the Confederates would slog through the mud, too, as the same as the Federals. By the way, just aside, 40% of the members of the 11th Corps left Gettysburg barefoot. Federal Army had outstretched their supply lines. If it's 40% in the 11th Corps, it's probably a percent in the other corps too. So the Rebs weren't the only ones barefoot. Anyhow, the Council War, there's no question, he should have went with his gut because he looks bad, he looks weak. Have you ever been down there where Lee's lines were? If any of you haven't, you should go down sometime. It's just drew a blank, and that's not unusual. It was Jones's Crossroads before the war. But if you're heading south from Hagerstown on the Sharpsburg Road, you come to, begins with an L. It's a crossroads. If you turn right and drive about a mile or so, you're going to see that ridge line. That's where Lee's army was. They said it was one of the strongest defensive positions they ever held. And I will tell you that many men in the federal ranks, rank and file, they were happy that they were not ordered across that ground. But Lincoln never forgave Meade for it. And it looked bad. And, you know, the old thing, counsels of war never fight. So, in that sense. But for Meade's own standing, and again, he's not that highly criticized among the common soldiers. Same thing will happen to him in Mine Run. You know, he will not launch attacks that he looked at that were probably suicidal, and his men in the ranks thank him for it in their letters home and stuff. You know, because to them he took care of their lives, and they appreciated that. But that's it. No, I don't know whether he could have overtaken them, and they probably should have tested it, but I don't fault him as bad as some historians do.
You had mentioned earlier that probably the worst thing that happened was when Ewell came the first day, afternoon.
I can say the worst thing.
Well, you said that was one of the worst things that happened when Ewell came and they actually won that first day. Had Ewell...
Well, that was a I misspoke if I said that, and what I said is Ewell's decision to resume to attack and getting permission from Lee reluctantly tied the army here.
Right. Well, if he would have left Ewell at Harrisburg to continue what he was doing there, they might not even fought here.
Well, yes, but he had once he
made that choice at Chancellorsville his best victory when he split the army up. Now he brought them together and had his worst defeat.
Well, I don't think that correlates. When Harrison reported that the Federal Army was just basically south of the Maryland border, Pennsylvania border, Lee had to reconcentrate. He was also, remember, this is hostile territory. This is not Virginia. He had to reconcentrate. What is interesting is he had a choice. 7 of his infantry divisions are west of the South Mountain. What does Lee do? He orders a concentration east of South Mountain, where you are in a position, and he hoped this. And folks, I will tell you something too on this. Lee never promised to fight a defensive battle in Pennsylvania when Longstreet wrote that. However, not only Longstreet, John B. Hood, Lee's staff officers, in the discussions as they marched north, it was more or less decided that if they could, and the preference was to fight a defensive battle. Now, Lee could not have promised that. It was absurd, and he said that. But the sentiment was that they were going to try to maneuver the Federals. Or the other opportunity was, and that happens on July the 1st, can you defeat part of the Army of Potomac that stretched out on the march north? And that's what they do on July the 1st. They defeat 2 of the corps of the Army of Potomac. So, no, he had to concentrate. He was too far flung, and he didn't know where the bulk of the army was, and he didn't even know where Stuart was. The last he had heard of Stuart was he read in the newspapers that he had attacked that wagon train in Rockville, Maryland. And that was from northern newspapers telling Lee where Stuart was.
Could you talk a little bit about Lee's health here at Gettysburg? Lee's health.
Oh, Lee's health. Well, it's alleged, I guess it's been reported at least suffered from diarrhea. The only source for that is William Blackford of Jeb Stuart's staff. Now, he may have had problems, I don't know, you know, in their parlance, it was Virginia Quick Step. He could have suffered from that. The other question, of course, is Lee suffers a severe illness in March of 1863. He will tell his wife in October that he not recovered from it. I was at a conference last year, and Dr. Bud Robertson said he had talked to physicians, described the symptoms and some of the reports of Lee, and they said he suffered a major heart attack in March. There's a Dr. Bemis, a Kentuckian. His papers are at the Virginia Historical Society. Guild, Chief Surgeon of the Army, he goes in temporary leave in early April '63, and Bemis is in charge of attending to Lee. I know this is convoluted, but I want to tell you this. Bemis says by about the second week in April, Lee is doing real well. If Lee had a massive heart attack, I can't see where he was doing real well. Now, again, he says he's not feeling well in October from the effects of what happened. Most historians think it's some kind of heart. After the war, Charles Marshall wrote it wasn't a heart, it was pneumonia, severe case of pneumonia. But I would go on the side of the heart. I don't know how. Now, I've also heard where Lee was suffering from a malaria again here, and he was in opium or something and infected his judgment. Unless you show me something in writing, I'm not going to believe that. I'm simply not. You know, we can speculate, and you know, as I said one time jokingly, if you want to think that Gettysburg that Lee lost at Gettysburg because of diarrhea, that's essentially an outhouse theory of history that really doesn't work. You know, so, you know, I'm not going down there. I don't know. Yeah. Is that it?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Wert.